Hi, everyone. This is part two of the American Radicalism lecture. I'm just going to jump right back into it with one caveat. I checked the previous video and I saw that the videos weren't playing. So, what I'm going to do is skip past the videos for the rest of the lecture, but you already will have received this by the time you're watching this part of the video, but I'll send out links to the videos so you can just watch them and then resume the lecture afterwards. So, without further ado, let me get back to Paul Robeson, who is probably my favorite person covered in this piece. So, who is Paul Robeson? He's an incredibly interesting character. He was most prominent in the 30s, 40s, 50s. He was born in New Jersey. He was the son of a preacher and former slave. He was an All-American football player, which means that he was one of the top players in all of like university athletics in the U.S. at the time. At a time when there were very few black players allowed to play because of it was in the 1910s, 1920s he was playing. Um, and I read his autobiography. He describes like the first practice he did, similar to rugby, a very violent kind of sport. All the players were stepping on his fingers, and he was at Rutgers University in New Jersey, and all the players stepped on his fingers, and he just said, he kept coming back twice as hard as they hit him, and eventually earned their respect, and then became the best player on the team. Then he went to Columbia Law School. He was also a stage actor. He was a Shakespearean actor. He traveled the world performing in plays. He lived in London for a long time. He was a singer. He was a popularizer of Negro spiritual music, which was songs that were sung by slaves on the plantation when they were working before the end of slavery, and he popularized that as a musical genre in the 1930s with some recordings, which are really really beautiful recordings. I think he was great in many things, but his I love his music, and he was a fantastic, very soulful singer. And he was also a civil rights activist, an avowed socialist. Um, he was a friend of the Soviet Union. He traveled there in the 1950s. That created a lot of trouble for him because of the sort of very fervent anti-communism of the time. Um, but he was really a leading figure in the black community in America in the 1930s and 40s. Probably the most popular African American person in the United States for much of that time. And then his popularity kind of waned after he became more outspoken in his left-wing politics and his sympathies with the Soviet Union in the 50s. His passport was actually revoked by the U.S. government in the 50s because of these sorts of trips he was doing. And he also his son and many other people have alleged that he was poisoned, or had the CIA or some U.S. intelligence agency had something to do with his kind of mental and physical decline, which happened very rapidly in the 1960s after he was in the Soviet Union, and he had a nervous breakdown, and he was sort of debilitated for the rest of his life. Um, so he had a very complex, interesting life. He was very big man, had a very kind of he was a stage presence, deep baritone voice, um, command of all languages, different languages, and he was sort of the global voice of African Americans for the middle of the 20th century. And most importantly, he was sort of a predecessor for Martin Luther King and Malcolm X. I think before in the generation of civil rights leaders before them, he was probably one of the most important figures. So having so here's an interview with him. I'll skip it, but this is an interview that he gives on Australian television talking about race relations. Um, Continue on. So if this is I kind of sorry sorry about that. So I touched on this before. So he was denied his passport and couldn't leave the U.S. in the 50s because there was suspicions that he would support and encourage left wing revolutionary movements around the world. He got his passport back in the late 50s, and then he lived in London, but he suffered a nervous breakdown in Moscow, which ended his public life. But yeah, his son has alleged that his father was poisoned or drugged by American or British intelligence to neutralize his activism. And in the 40s and 50s, he traveled the world, visited unions, socialist parties in different places. He was a great speaker. He would sing. He would, give. He was a brilliant performer and a real charismatic presence. Um, he also started a newsletter in the 1950s called Freedom, which covered lynching and covered a lot of racial issues at a time when the kind of white-dominated press very rarely discussed the issues of the black community. This is a photo. This is a cartoon showing the Martinsville Seven, which was a group of seven young black men who were wrongfully convicted for crimes they didn't commit, of which there was very little evidence that they committed because it was a white-dominated kind of racist jury and local judicial system. So his, being showing these men being hung by the Statue of Liberty by America itself is sort of, the imagery that he used, quite powerful and very radical imagery. Um, Almost, any kind of picture where you're going to see the Statue of Liberty, it's going to be in a positive figure, not in this sort of villainous, but it's an indictment of America itself, and that's quite, interesting. And he was, a great writer, and this was an important publication at the time. And this is one of my favorite, definitely my favorite video of this course. You can play it yourself, but it's Paul Robeson. It's a kind of a television presentation of Paul Robeson visiting this Scottish miner group in the late 1940s, and he goes and walks among them and sort of, has a meal with them, and then ultimately he sings a song, the song Joe Hill, which is a kind of labor unionist song about a man named Joe Hill who was an American, labor unionist who was ultimately killed for crimes he didn't commit. Um, and he is sort of memorialized by this song, and it's kind of saying Joe Hill is dead, but the spirit of labor solidarity lives on in the song and in the movement. But yeah, brilliant video. So I'll let you watch that. Um, skip it. So the next figure, and I could talk forever about Robeson because he's great. But the next figure is a sort of interesting comparison to Robeson because William Buckley, for those of you who might know him, was probably the leading voice and intellectual figure of American conservatism in the sort of post-war period of the 1950s, 1960s, and then his career, he died in the last 15, 20 years, but he was always one of the most influential um, conservative voices. He had a television show um, called Firing Line, which is mentioned in the third bullet point, where he would interview people, other conservatives, people on the left, various public figures. He was an extremely articulate, kind of verbose, very witty guy, but his his politics were very, in retrospect, they weren't that, like he was a supporter of segregation in the 1950s, early 1960s. He changed his mind on that. He was very against. He was sort of on the wrong side of all kind of social issues, progressive social issues of the late 20th century. Feminism, um, civil rights. Like he was a critic and opponent of these things until it became politically necessary for him to, accept that, gay marriage is legitimate, or that, women have the same rights as men, and that, African Americans should have, there should be civil rights legislation to, deal with the inequalities and continued discrimination. These were things that he had, he was opposed at first. So his radicalism is because he was quite outspoken and, he used very fiery rhetoric at times. It was often in the name of very conservative clauses and conservative causes. And I think for that reason, he kind of stands as an important kind of conservative radical figure who was saying that, I'm standing against the liberal mainstream and I have to be radical in my conservatism because things have gone so far askew from where they were, is a sort of argument I think that radical conservatives might offer. And a lot of the people that I studied in my thesis, as I've discussed, were sort of radical conservatives, many of whom rejected people like Buckley in the Republican Party because they saw them as too liberal, because they were so far to the far right, extreme right people, that they someone like Buckley, who was fairly mainstream, was seen as like a sellout to the real conservative or the real patriotic movement, which was, they identified themselves as that, like they had very extreme views, but that was just the sort of the rhetorical style of that, like radical right wing politics, which still goes on today with kind of divisions between Trump and other more moderate Republicans that he calls, rhinos. I don't know if this is a term that has been popularized much in the UK, but hasn't been heard much in the UK. But rhino is a term used by Trump and his allies, RINO, Republican in name only, to talk about conservatives who they see as insufficiently committed to conservative policies and ideas. But back to Buckley. So he became famous in the early 1950s. He wrote a book. He studied at Yale University about how Yale was kind of overly influenced by secular socialist kind of academics, and it was contrary to the kind of conservative values that define America. And then in 1955, he founded National Review magazine, which is probably the first major and the most important intellectual conservative magazine in the U.S. in the sort of post-war period, and that really helped bring these ideas into the mainstream. I think in the 1960s had about 80,000 subscribers, so not a huge influence, but people who were worked in the political world often read him both on the left and on the right. So he was him and the people he assembled to write for the magazine were fairly influential. He also had the show Firing Line that I mentioned, which was the kind of one of the most important political debate shows on U.S. television for many decades, and would sort of set the model for kind of subsequent debate shows. Um, and Buckley was, excellent in that venue. I highly recommend look up Firing Line. All of it is on YouTube. Like I think almost every episode, and it's really a brilliant historical resource. I've spent countless hours looking at that kind of stuff, and it's interesting to see the sort of debates that were taking place, the different characters that are on the show. But he ran unsuccessfully for mayor in New York in the '60s, and his brother was a senator from New York, but he never was involved in electoral politics on his own, and like beyond that in his personal life. He was committed to sort of ideas, publication, wrote a number of books, was always on television, sort of a public figure, and the first major conservative public figure. So he's, yeah, a radical, or like, quite a like a it was both quite radical and conservative in his conservatism. So this is a line from him. I'll let you read it out. Radical conservatives in this country. So the line about being ignored or humiliated by a great many of those on the well-fed right, whose ignorance and amorality have never been exaggerated. So I think the important line from this is the last one. Ideas have to go into exchange to become or remain operative, and the medium of such exchange is the printed word. So I think that was sort of his thinking behind the National Review, was that you have to, like, the ideas themselves are nothing without the work of kind of spreading them around. They have to go into exchange, and I think that's where Buckley was, quite influential, was in his ability through television and the printed word, magazines, different books, at spreading those ideas. So this is a video about William Buckley and Gore Vidal, who was a kind of a prominent liberal intellectual and writer, cultural critic, um, during the. He also kind of lived and wrote at the same time. So that will be in the link. So kind of one of the last questions is, how do we evaluate these radical figures in American history today? So someone like William Buckley was quite radical during his time. Now I think he really laid the groundwork for much of what is the American conservative movement. And this is kind of stuff that I'm studying for my research. The sort of institutions, think tanks, publications, campaign organizations that now kind of structure the Republican Party, their political strategy, the sort of related kind of ideological dimension of the realm of ideas for both for policy and for more kind of public facing kind of writing. Buckley and his kind of colleagues and sort of cohort of conservative activists from the 50s and 60s and 70s onwards were the ones that kind of planted the seeds that ultimately blossomed into these institutions. And whether I'm critical of these, I generally disagree with the ideas kind of espoused by these organizations, but they're quite effective at what they do. And I think the conservatism of American political discourse, especially in comparison to the UK or to even more so to other European countries, I think speaks to how good these groups are at what they do in a way, because they've managed to change the debate and change the discussion and change the terms that we use to think about issues in America, to suit their own vision of politics in a way that I don't think that's a good thing, but I think that it speaks to their effectiveness. But that's sort of a type of radicalism which I don't have much sympathy with. Like I'm more, I don't know, I have like the radicalism of a Bernie Sanders. To me, we all are entitled to our different political views. I see that as more truly radical because that's about changing things for the in a positive direction, as opposed to fighting this kind of culture war that Buckley and Trump and other conservatives today are sort of concerned with, against wokeism and these kinds of things, which to me is sort of a manufactured issue. So you can posture as a radical, but you're not. Really, what are these kind of conservative radicals? What do they want to change? They just want to lower taxes for kind of wealthy people and corporations. They don't have much of a policy agenda. But I think looking back into American history, these sort of figures, Paul Robeson on race, and racial issues in the 20th century, William Jennings Bryan about inequality in the sort of the Gilded Age, the populist age, John Brown in the period of slavery and the fight about slavery, and then Thomas Paine as a sort of during the American Revolution. These were sort of among the most important figures of their time in terms of shaping the debates of those times, and shaping what are the main ideas, main ways of thinking about things, what are the arguments that people use against each other, because there's a sort of a top down thing of like not to say the great thinkers, but the prolific writers and sort of intellectuals of a period through their ideas get written down in books, then it kind of goes into other publications which are more public facing, and that kind of shapes, not totally because people have their own agency, but it shapes the way that people of the time think and talk about these issues. And I think underpinning, beyond the content of the arguments about for or against slavery or for or against, the sort of culture war conservatism that William Buckley kind of embodied. You have the media of the time as well is an issue. Like someone like John Brown, like he wasn't producing his own publications in the way that some of these other figures were, but he was written about extensively after his raid on Harper's Ferry, and that kind of was a major media event of the time, and really kind of was part of a series of events that led up to the Civil War. Not to attribute its whys, it wouldn't have happened without it, but it was part of the story. And I think looking at these other figures and other kind of related figures who I will I'll have an email that will circulate with some other kind of radical characters who I didn't get to talk about who but might be worth looking into. Yeah, like the kind of the way that their message and their identity is mediated in the time, whether it be through pamphlets in colonial America or through radio and now Fox News and things like that. That's just like the interplay between these men and their ideas and the women as well, because you have a lot of important female radicals like Harriet Tubman, who were like played similar kind of roles in their period. Just how do they how they were mediated by the time. This is a kind of a useful video about political extremism and radicalism in the 20th century. I'll let you guys watch that. So I think just to conclude, so who are today's radicals and why should we be careful with the term radical? We have far-right extremists, democratic socialists, conspiracy theorists, Trump, Bernie Sanders, Corbyn. Others all have people that could be described as radicals, also described as populists. But there are a number of different terms that are thrown around, which often lose their precision and lose their kind of analytical utility as they're kind of used in political media in a very partisan kind of way. But when we're looking at it as as scholars and as social scientists, historians, whatever your kind of discipline that you like to identify with or that you think about these issues through the lens of, we want to be really precise in how we think about it. And I think one of the points I wanted to get across with this talk is that radicalism is quite an ambiguous concept. And it's hard to say. You can't say radicalism is good or bad. You can't say radicalism is left or right. You have the kind of dichotomy of a terrorist is like a freedom. Someone could be a terrorist to one side and a freedom fighter to the other. I'm sure an issue that is close to the heart of many British people is the Irish independence and or the fight for Irish independence, as it might be framed by people who or Irish Republicans or sympathize with the IRA, and then you have people on the other side who see it as a guerrilla war waged against innocent people for a lost cause, as many English and other British people might feel about it. So I think radicalism, I wish I could offer a more kind of conclusive conclusion, but I think it's the point of it is the ambiguity, and I think that is a good starting point for historical analysis, like looking at different examples or kind of trying to make sense of what's going on today. And one kind of another interesting point I think about the language about how we talk about this of extremism and radicalism, the kind of the term extremism was really popularized kind of in the 1950s by sort of liberal social scientists, mostly based in the U.S., also in the UK to a degree as well. But they saw, in a period after World War II, when the dual threat of communism still was there, but the threat of far-right extremism on the other side of fascism and Nazism was very fresh in the minds of Americans at the time. There was a sense that the liberal center, which is really what a lot of them argued through their historical work, was the sort of the American tradition, not an extremist tradition or not something kind of tending towards class conflict like European society was, but this kind of liberal values, which are quite themselves ambiguous in what they really mean, is the best position, and the sort of the far left and the far right suffer from the same problems. And that's kind of a useful metaphor in some ways. It can also obscure differences between the left and the right, but I think that's kind of a useful way. That term extremism, which is kind of gives you a notion of there's an acceptable spectrum and then there's the unacceptable spectrum of extremism, is itself a relatively new historical concept. It was only really in the 1950s that was kind of coined and came to shape our thinking about these issues. So that I just thought that would be worth noting as well. And so to conclude as well, so what does this have to do with American politics? in a sense, radicalism is always becomes mainstream. Radicals throughout history have been fundamental in the development of American political institutions. Started the revolution, opposed slavery, argued against wealthy corporate interests and for the working classes, built international solidarity, and built new movements. They took a historical stand and went beyond traditional means of doing politics, changing the ways that we understand issues like legitimate government, race, class, and many other issues in America and beyond. And for this, they are quintessentially American and must be understood in order to fully make sense of American politics today. Having given that a bit of rhetorical flourish, just to go back to what I had said in the beginning, so I think like you have the element of American politics of you have this many senators and this is how the government works. But I think this is to me the kind of juicier stuff of American history, and I think hopefully you guys learn from this. I think there were some kind of maybe you've heard of some of these people, but a lot of them are lesser known figures, and some of the other people who I'll kind of include in the email. Or even perhaps even less known figures, but still just as interesting, if not more interesting, depending on what your taste is. So I would say at the end, like to conclude, as you kind of approach the Q&A and then the essays about this topic, come to the Q&A with questions about the broader changes in American politics. Like one thing I love to talk about, my previous lecture was on populism. Is populism, and what is the role of like of populist language and ideas? Because many William Jennings Bryan to Trump could both claim some part of the populist legacy, and two very different figures, a number of other figures. Huey Long, who might be I will include an email, who was used very populist language. So I think that's something that might be worth talking about, or broader changes in American history or European history as well, because I think concurrent changes happen even in different countries in terms of the political responses to kind of broadly similar structural changes. So yeah, I'm looking forward to the Q&A. I always really enjoy the discussions with this group. But yeah, so looking forward to it. Right, today it's April 2nd, so I'll see you guys approximately 1 week, and yeah, take care.